Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder to support the broadcast. Best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Geopolitics and Empire Substack, a little over $9 a month or a little over $90 a year. I do a weekly write-up of the most important news of the week and a commentary, and this has become very popular. And so to get access to that, you need to become a paid subscriber. We also do a Zoom chat every week or two that's private with paid subscribers only, where we shoot the breeze on current events. And sometimes we're being back past podcast guests for a live Q&A. You can also donate through Buy Me a Coffee, Donor Box, Wise, purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about whatever you like: expatriation, Latin America, Mexico, geopolitics, or the meaning of life. And our sponsor this month is Mikkel Thorup's Expat Money Summit, which is about to pop off the October 7th to the 11th. It is online entirely, and it's free. You do need to register. The link is in the description. So do that. I'll be participating on one of the World War III panels, and most of the headline speakers have been guests on Geopolitics and Empire. Dr. Ron Paul, Scott Horton, Mark Faber, and many others. And the summit is all about internationalization, offshore real estate investment, basically preparing for the end of the world as we know it, as I like to say. Do check out my affiliates: Legal Shield, EasyDNS.com, Wise Wolf Gold, Escape the Technocracy, great course from Gabriel Custodiate, Above Phone, and others. And do leave a podcast review. Take 5 minutes out to do that. That's a big help. Joining us on his maiden voyage on Geopolitics and Empire is Jeff Rich, who's a writer, historian, podcaster, and now retired government official. He's published 3 books: Gathering Flowers of the Mind from the Burning Archive and 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat. He has forgotten how many government briefings he wrote. He lives in Melbourne, Australia. Welcome finally to Geopolitics and Empire, Jeff.
Really glad to be here, Robert. It's wonderful to chat with you on your podcast, which I've been listening to for, I don't know, it must be like 4 or 5 years now, I think. But yeah, fantastic to be here.
Yeah, we used to chat almost on a monthly basis at the now defunct TNT Radio,
Yeah.
but all the archives are still there. I'll link to them in this podcast description. And just for maybe real quick, for people who aren't familiar with you, I briefly read your bio. You're retired now. How is retirement from the government, and anything else you want to add to your bio?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's good. I started life out, I guess, trying to be a historian. I did a PhD in history back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, back when, I recall, listening to the Berlin Wall coming down. And but then I spent 33 years as a government official in, lots of different social policy roles, especially in the state or, provincial, regional government in Victoria, in Australia. But in 2022, I sort of took early retirement, or was retired early, depending on how you put it, with the government sort of running out of money and having to reduce staffing. And then I sort of really launched myself into writing, which I had been doing sort of online since really 2010, writing about world history and I guess the multipolar world, how the world is changing, but also trying to understand it in a broad sense, both politics and culture and society and the sort of rival empires of the world or rival powers of the world. And I now have a Substack and a YouTube channel, and I sort of talk about all those sorts of issues there.
And you are finding your rhythm with your content creation. Yeah. Some of your YouTube videos where it's just you monologuing are hitting tens of thousands of views. Maybe I should stop interviewing people and just start doing monologues. And so you're doing great work there. Your Substack, your YouTube, that's all linked in the description. And so you mentioned the world is changing. The IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, just announced Israel is invading Lebanon. Mm-hmm. Reading the news today, Zelensky seems to be egging Putin on to drop some nukes. So, the world's going mad. Where are we, Jeff? And how is the world changing as you see it?
Yeah, it's a pretty scary place. I think the last time I was on your TNT show, Reveille, it was just after, October 7 happened, I think. And so now it's just after the Lebanon events have happened. October seems to be a bad year, a bad time in the world. I guess a lot of people are worried about World War III, all that sort of thing. And I do feel we are in a kind of a global conflict. But I guess what I sort of like to think about often on my YouTube channel is what are the sort of stories or the sort of embedded narratives we have that we use to sort of conceptualize and see what's happening in the world. And although I do think, we are in a global conflict now. There's the war in Ukraine, there's the war in Gaza, there's the war of Yemen, there's growing confrontations in the, South China Sea, Philippines and China and all that sort of stuff. And growing provocations from the US towards China. So there's global conflicts all over the world. But I think the issue I have with calling it World War III is I just wonder whether that sort of plays into a kind of a story that it will be a repeat of. It's like the third in the series of World War One and World War Two. Then there's World War Three, and in World War One, America sort of came in at the end and came out dominant financial power in the world. In World War II, America came in a little bit late and, came out dominant power in the world, and then used a nuclear bomb against Japan. And then and in World War III, well, America's going to come out on top again, isn't it? But I kind of think, in a way, what's going on now is America's not going to come out on top in this global conflict because the underlying sort of processes of change in the world are really not to the advantage of America, and they're sort of undermining the sort of world system or the empire, if you like, that America operates. So, if you like, what I sometimes describe this as is the nature of globalization has changed. So globalization is no longer westernization. The forces for change are coming from the rest of the world, and they're sort of forcing the power structures, the culture, and all the rest of it of the West to sort of recalibrate, to change its position in the world. And what really scares me is that a lot of people in the Western elites don't see that, and will fight to the death, I guess, to prevent that. And that's a very, very scary scenario, especially with the latest provocations of Iran and all that sort of thing.
And just on that point, there was something I was going to bring up that I feel is related to what you said, which just yesterday I read. It was published, I think, a day or two ago at the Hudson Institute. I think the incoming Prime Minister of Japan calling for Asian NATO, and in my weekly roundup of my news, I feel there's this paradox sometimes where, as you said, the West may not come out on top, but right now it seems they're winning. Israel, for example. Just looking at some of the tweets, Michael Tracy came out and said, the lesson: Israel can still ravage whoever it wants with virtual impunity, not just because of limitless U.S. backing, but because the tough-talking enemies of Israel are not nearly as threatening as they're often made out to be. Hezbollah is just a punching bag at this point. Nicolas Soldo, fisted by Foucault, his popular geopolitical commentator, he says, Russia, China, India have no issues with Israel that are serious enough for them to get involved. The Arabs couldn't give a shit either, except for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And so, on the one hand, Israel and America seem to have currently, they're just rolling through, defeating everyone. And this, I thought this was very important. This article, which talks about, again, Japan's incoming PM Shigeru Ishiba calling for the creation of an Asian version of NATO.
Mm.
And he basically echoed what I said to my recent interview to Cameron Leckie in my podcast with him, that AUKUS and Quad are just basically like the building blocks for this global NATO, and plugging Asia into it. And I say, you're going to go, you have a bilateral agreement, becomes a trilateral arrangement, becomes a quadrilateral arrangement, until voila, you have the Asian NATO. You go from North Atlantic Treaty Organization to a planetary new alliance treaty organization, which is their goal. And in this article by the incoming prime minister, he's talking about all these different arrangements they have between US, Japan, South Korea, so on and so forth, and basically tightening them together sort of asymmetrically and pulling on the strings closer and closer until you have this web where basically you have NATO in Asia now. And I mean, he even talks about that should mean America's sharing of nuclear weapons, or the introduction of nuclear weapons into the region. And so I sort of agree with your premise, what you said, but right now it just seems like the West seems to be winning. Any thoughts on that, as well as the what's happening, the Asian NATO or NATO in general?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, the West is in the dominant position. I mean, America does have its, whatever it is, 800,000 people, military bases around the world. A lot of them are around Japan and South Korea and all the rest of it. I mean, I guess the events in Lebanon are also, I've seen a few people comment, like Peter Lavelle and George Samueli, say, well, this is a bit of a surprise. Hezbollah doesn't seem to have been quite the force maybe we thought it was, and we might need to rethink how we saw events happening. So, yeah, it is, America is, the West is in this powerful position, but underneath that sort of military positioning, I think there's all these other changes going on that make that power projection ultimately unsustainable, I think. And that's what I think so I don't think this is going to be over soon, or it won't be like a lay down misère sort of situation, to use a sort of card player's metaphor. It will be a slow, long, difficult struggle, and I don't know what the outcome of it is. But my sense is that the growing prosperity in the rest of the world, the growing resource advantages in the rest of the world, the growing cultural interconnections between the rest of the world, like, between Russia and China, between Eurasia, within Eurasia, all the rest of it, will mean that that current military positioning of advantage that the West has will ultimately sort of fall away. And the Asian NATO story is sort of interesting as well. So, I mean, I might comment a bit on that as well, if you like. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I did an interview with Pascal Attaz at Neutrality Studies. He's part of the little sort of multipolar peace alliance what do we call it? Multipolar social media peace alliance. I've not been a very good spokesperson for the network there, but and we talked about how NATO has always been inextricably linked with, I guess, Western colonialism, and that if you look at some of the deeper sort of imperial empire story of NATO, it was really formed in the years after World War II in a shattered post-1945 world, devastated by war, in which America is, the military governor occupying Japan, and it is actually, Japan is not an independent state at all. It's run by General MacArthur or whatever. there's a sort of a partnership formed between the United States and the European empires, including the British Empire, the Dutch, I'm having a mental blank. The French. I mean, France has Vietnam and Cambodia as a colonial possession until the mid 1950s. Indonesia is a Dutch colony that, falls apart in a very difficult way. And the British Empire is still a very strong force, including, in the country where I live, in Australia. And it's NATO is formed in part as a expression of weakness, in part from the United States, fear of the Soviet Union, fear of communism, including, socialism within Western countries, especially within Europe. And it's a kind of a partnership formed between the old European empires and the new American empire. And it was always present, therefore, in Asia. The British Empire was, here in Australia, in Malaysia, only left India in 1947 in terrible circumstances. It had Hong Kong, all of this sort of thing. So there was always that role. And then when NATO formed, the military expansion of the United States around the world is astonishingly quick. Like, I think from memory, from reading the history, there's like 400 military bases around the world by 1955. So that early period of the formation of NATO, the early period of the Cold War, you can't really tell that story without a sense of global power projection of the United States, and also the decolonisation process and the imperial disintegration process as well, which occurs through the 50s, 60s and 70s. I mean, East Timor is the last, which ultimately only really gets finally resolved in the 1990s, when East Timor forms as a state separate from sort of Indonesia, and Australia's involved in the peacekeeping operations. That finishes in the 1990s, and the Portuguese leave East Timor in like 75 or something like that. So, I mean, the disintegration of the European empires as part of the Cold War, as part of American power projection and rivalry with the Soviet Union and with China around the world is, within my living memory. It's part of the story. So I kind of feel, in a way, what we're seeing with Asian NATO is a renewal of that story of the partnership between America and the other powerful states around the world, both in Europe and, Japan and the, Asian tigers. And in a way, it's in part a reflection of the weakness of America, that it can't actually sustain this power projection around the world. And it needs, Europe to do more, like a lot of American politicians say. It needs Japan to do more. It needs Korea to do more. It needs Australia to do more. That's what AUKUS is. We're sort of contributing hundreds of billions of dollars to British and American, military defence industries, and enabling America to put nuclear submarine bases in Australia in order to kind of, threaten China. So it's almost a process of the United States calling in its assets from its allies. It's saying, we can't do this alone. We need you to help us more. And for a lot of the elites within those countries, like in Australia, that a lot of their power, status, authority, their sort of social networks, if you like, are tied up with the successful projection of American power. So they're all saying, oh yeah, we're going to be the best allies we possibly can, and throw in our our territory to help keep American primacy going. But I just think that objective of keeping American primacy going when the economics of the world, the resources of the world, the diplomacy of the world, the culture of the world has changed has been redistributed so much, it's an impossible objective, and it will ultimately fail, even though it doesn't mean, people will give up that objective quickly.
And just on Japan for a second, I mean, reading this article from the incoming prime minister, reading other mainstream Bloomberg and other pieces when it comes to the U.S.-Japan relationship, and it's incredible. It's like Japan is the best example of someone who's been absorbed by the Death Star, by the empire, and now it's been made integrated fully and completely. And you've got like this prime minister of Japan. It's almost like what he's calling for. It's not Japan first. It's actually America first. It's basically the policy of Japan is serving first Washington before it serves first national interests. And it's just incredible. It's really incredible to watch. The Japanese political elites, how they are just so pathetically subservient to the West, to the detriment, I think, of their own populations. Maybe to get your thoughts on the economy, I think I've seen you comments on your channel, just big picture when it comes to the dollar status, all this BRICS talk, BRICS currencies from petrodollar to petro yuan, gold. That was something I wrote about on my wrap up this weekend, how Iran has increased sixfold its gold purchases over the past year. And then you can see some signs where countries like Israel now are looking to ban possession of precious metals. And it's just like, wow. And the FTC tweeted, I included this in my wrap up. They tweeted, they said, gold is a scam, effectively. And they ended up deleting it. I didn't know that they deleted that tweet. So when you've got like Israel telling its own citizens, you're not going to be able to own gold. The FTC says gold is a scam. Meanwhile, Iran is buying a sixfold increase. Something is going on. That's like a signal when it comes. Gold is skyrocketing. Something's wrong with the global system, the dollar, the world reserve, and all this trade that's happening, BRICS, Belt and Road. Your thoughts on the economic aspect of this world transition?
Yep. Well, again, I'm not really an economist, and I'm certainly not anyone should pay any attention to in terms of investment advice. So I absolutely would not sort of take my word from that. But there are way too many people out there who are sort of making, who are offering that with some pretty dodgy ideas about kind of what's happening. To some degree, I tend to pay a lot of attention to the economic historian Adam Tooze, who's written a series of books that look at, I guess, the economic financial history of the world from sort of, the Great War of 1914 through to current day, including kind of what happened during the sort of COVID crisis. And he really, he's probably as well informed about the sort of structure and the history of the sort of financial system of the world as anyone. And he certainly sees this inherent tension between, I guess, the US financial world system, the US dollar and all the rest of it, and the changing trade balances, the changing, center of gravity, I guess, of the world around China with industry, and the I guess the BRICS countries with commodities, etc. And their own financial power. I mean, like I think most of the large banks in the world are Chinese banks. They're not American banks anymore. It's not. So people probably need to revise some of the sort of early 20th century images sometimes people have of who the bankers of the world are. And he really portrays the US dollar system as a lot more contingent or sort of like shaky, I guess. It's something that constantly needs to be kept going, that is constantly changing and responding to the different flows of financial and economic transactions around the world, but is always also very closely tied to, I guess, the geopolitical aims of the United States as well. And he sees this tension between, the hegemonic system of the US dollar and the sort of multipolar, I guess, commodity national currency based system. And he basically says, I mean, he doesn't know how it's going to play out, but that the intention to try to keep the American dollar working the way it has is probably unsustainable given that shift of gravity of forces. And he had a really interesting discussion, I think, and I think I might have linked to this in one of my YouTube videos, with the Hungarian economist Zoltán Pozsár, who talked about, a new Bretton Woods agreement and things like that. And I mean, it doesn't really seem like the world diplomacy is quite in a state to come up with a new Bretton Woods agreement. So I think we worked out in the banking offices and the political offices and the battlefields of the world. But the other reflection I'd have is often people talk about US dollar, reserve currency, US dollar empire, as if there's always been a reserve currency in the world that's operated in the way that the US dollar has. And, first, it used to be the British Empire, and then people get a bit murkier about the history, and it's not actually the real history of the currencies of the world. The gold standard wasn't really around all that long. It was partly based on the fact that Britain could extract a lot of gold from, quite close to where I live here in Victoria, and from South Africa in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, in a way, they were like Britain through its empire and its colonies was like the BRICS commodities nations of the world back then. And so it was probably in their favour to make gold the currency standard of the world. And the US dollar system itself is operated in different ways over different times. So I think people should resist the temptation to sort of read back the very unique situation of the US dollar since 1944 into previous history and similarly push it out into the future. It's not gonna be the way it was. It will be a different system. China won't end up being like America with a US dollar. There'll be some other, probably more complicated, more, fragmented, more multipolar, if you like, system of currency systems and transactions around the world. So I think it will end up being, rather than it being a simple story of, one superpower replacing another in the financial world, it will be a more complicated story of one hegemonic system breaking down and then there being multiple different financial systems in the world, which will probably be good for all the economists in the world who have to try to explain all of that, but maybe not so good for us poor old people who are trying to sort of work out how to operate our super funds.
Yeah, I really appreciate that take, and I'd agree with you that we can't just look to the immediate past and think that's what's gonna that sort of model is gonna be what it's like going forward. And I think it might be a more something that we never thought of, or something new in history, something more multilateral. I did just want to read this tweet from Ben Rickard on X. He says, the average American doesn't quite understand the dollar is dying. The Federal Reserve's reckless money printing combined with the U.S. government's insane fiscal policies have turned the dollar into a bloated corpse kept alive only by the illusion of confidence. And now that illusion is crumbling. And you mentioned Bretton Woods. I'm going, my working assumption, to borrow from my recent podcast guest, has been for a while that we are headed for a third world war, and that these crises then allow for new systems to emerge from the ashes, like they have always in past history. And I could see a Bretton Woods 3 or 4. Some people argue that we went on Bretton Woods, 2 or 3 or something after the petrodollar, but with the BRICS Global South leading the way, being them having the most advanced rough draft, and for sort of world organization type new international architecture. So you had Keynes during 1940s talking about Bancor. Now you have these countries talking about interoperable national digital currencies. And so, as you say, I think it's really difficult to suss out where we're headed, because there's going to be many different black swans, and probably a few surprises. And maybe to get your thoughts on something I'm being on about a lot. You've got the deep state, which you've got national deep states all around the world. You've got an international sort of deep state. And I was just thinking the other day, I was commenting on, again, in my paid subscription analysis, people go sign up to my paid subscription. But I did a write-up of how you had the Atlantic Council, NATO's brain, basically. They had these global citizen awards, and you had Klaus Schwab was there, Albert Bourla, Elon Musk, Giorgia Meloni. Sorry, not sorry. I think Meloni's been eaten up by the blob. She made a speech and she said, we need to be politicians need to be leaders. I'm a leader. And I'm thinking the only lead she's going to be following is the Atlantic Councils. And then it was crazy. I love the quote from Star Wars, which is, you will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. And it was, I call him Sauron or Skeletor, Alex Soros, George Soros' son. And this guy's all over the place. He's just posting on his Twitter recently photos of him with Hillary Clinton, wretched, what's her name, the Michigan governor, Wretched Whitmer. I like to call her Wretched Whitmer. Gretchen Whitmer, Illinois governor, Pritzker. And then he's with Tim Walz at the top of some apartment complex in New York. And someone online compared that photo. It looks eerily just like Al Pacino and Keanu Reeves in Devil's Advocate, where Al Pacino is the devil, and he's basically offering Keanu Reeves the world. And that's like Alex Soros offering Tim Walz the keys to the kingdom. And then he's there with the I call her Juanita Guaido. She's the Juanita Guaido of Belarus. I forget her full name, but she's the one that they keep supporting. They want a regime change,
something like that.
Lukashenko. And then David Lammy, I watched his intervention at the UN, and it just blew my mind. Like, what planet is this guy living in? He talks about, he plays that black man racist card, where he says, my forefathers were slaves, and he's sort of using that to talk against the Russian Empire. By the way, I looked up in etymology, the dictionary definition. It says the word slave came from Slav, because the Slavs were enslaved in mass. I'm a Slav. Anyone could play that card, Mr. Lammy, but it's the irony where he is a representative of the British Empire, the same people who enslaved his forefathers. And it's just like, him bringing that up in that way is so like absurd. But what are your thoughts when it comes to these different global elites? There are different factions. How do you sort of see all of that?
I did a couple of videos about Emmanuel Todd's book. Where is it? La Défaite de l'Occident. There we go. The Defeat of the West. he talks there about the sort of deep state, and specifically in relationship to America. He talks about the Washington gang, and he doesn't like the term deep state, and I don't particularly like it as well. But there is absolutely something about these people that is kind of, people have good reason to ask questions about them. I mean, it's Alex Soros, isn't it? He's like the ultimate trust fund kid who has way too much money to spend with bad ideas, and has such deep pockets. No one ever really. He's never actually forced to confront the vacuous nature of a lot of what he's actually saying. And I guess one of the reasons I also don't like I'm sort of a little bit reluctant to use terms like globalist elite and deep state is because, I worked for 33 years as a bureaucrat. Je suis le deep state. And I guess that experience meant, I was like, for 3 decades, I observed quite closely the, if you like, the sociology, the culture, the patterns of behaviour of people in power, both bureaucrats, politicians, but also the sort of kind of the parapolitical class, if you like, the sort of the media, the lobbies, the people like the World Economic Forum, etc., who are often just trust fund kids or wealthy businessmen who having made their money now want to kind of indulge their bad ideas about how to run the world. And I feel it's a much more they're not as smart or as thoughtful or as well organized or as effective as, ideas about globalist elites and deep state tend to sort of give them credit for. And so Emmanuel Todd in his book actually says, I don't think it's a deep state, it's actually a shallow state. And it's related to his broader argument that I guess the political leadership class in the West, and in a way, like all these people like Soros, etc., that you can almost see them not as, they're not philanthropists. They're sort of playing a sort of role in the theatre of politics. They're sort of getting up on stage and making pronouncements about, issues X and issues Y and using their money to advance different political causes. So they're sort of part of the political ecosystem. But his argument is that the leadership class has sort of lost all. It is shallow. It just plays games of theatrical politics, of what's going to be hitting the nightly news sort of thing, or trending on Twitter, I guess, to update the metaphor, and they've lost all, I guess, ethical grounding in a serious responsibility for running the institutions or developing a genuine culture of actually achieving something in the world. And as a result, they just, I guess, play silly games rather than actually really think through, well, what's actually involved in negotiating an end to a war, or what's really involved in sort of managing the sort of social affairs of a complex state like any of the ones that the viewers would be citizens of. And I think, to me, that is a truer reflection of what I observed in government, that it's often the political leaders, even the best ones, don't have any greater cognitive capacities than any of us. In a way, they're almost depressed cognitive capacities because they're sleep deprived. They're scheduled out of, their lives are scheduled to the minute. They have 1,000 different people shouting different ideas at them every week. They live in a cocoon of managed appearances that in the end they start to believe in their own, they're legends in their own lunchtime, as we say in Australia. And they're under enormous social pressure from the lobbies, the parapolitical class, the media class, who are really, I would argue, almost integrated now into that sort of parapolitical. I'll call it the virtual reality state. It's the constant. So many journalists become political advisors. So many political advisors become journalists. TV panel shows, all the rest of it. There's so much focus on spin, making the turning. It's when they make an announcement of a decision, it's all about the optics and the announcement. It's not actually about how are we going to make this actually work. You can even see that, I think, in the conduct of the war, like the Ukraine war. I sense that there's been a kind of a script for how events have meant to unfold over the Biden presidency. And you could almost interpret the way in which some of the bizarre diplomacy has happened as it was never going to go to that plan, but somehow we desperately have to keep it going to this plan. So, we'll go ahead with that NATO summit, or we'll go ahead with, the summer counter-offensive or whatever it was called to, or we'll do the invasion of Kursk just before, the November election to prove that Joe has defeated Vladimir Putin, and the clash between the reality and the manipulation of the reality is just extreme. So I don't know. That's a bit of a rambling answer, but I feel in a way the comforting it's not a very comforting thought to realise that Todd describes the Washington gang as nihilistic, vacuous, and shallow, and a sort of running this sort of zombie sort of empire. It's not a very comforting thought, but I think it's a more comforting thought to think that they're hopeless and they'll ultimately lose, kind of thing. So that's what I draw comfort from in the end, that it might be a long, slow haul, but this kind of poor political culture ultimately is going to disappoint too many people, not just the people from a popular thing, but ultimately, the military institutions will say, come on, we can't cope with this sort of nonsense anymore. The business institutions will say, we can't cope with this nonsense anymore. And ultimately people will organise to try to get something a little bit more effective. But it won't just come from, votes and elections and things like that. It will become more people's response to organising their own affairs in response to these sort of failures.
I like that you bring up all these different thinkers, and I always encourage that. People who listen, they often ask for, well, what book was that, or this? And Emmanuel Todd, I don't speak French. His stuff is mostly available in French. I have seen some videos here and there that had English subtitles, or Adam Tooze, again, someone, you've done some videos on that. People can check out. They can get Adam Tooze's books and yeah, what you mentioned earlier about these politicians who sort of begin to believe in their own, I don't know what you call it, godhood or divinity or delusional, deity. And, like you said, you worked for many decades as a bureaucrat. Your book, again, is titled 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat.
There it is. There it is. Little plug there. That's a picture of Mencius on the front there. So evoking the Chinese tradition of statecraft, I guess. But
I've got the Kindle version. It's just much easier for me here in Mexico to just get it instantly digitally than wait weeks or a month. And it's much more costlier. And then the technocracy. This as you're sort of discussing the administrative state, the bureaucratic state, the managerial state. There's so many words for this. I had on recently Ned Ryan, who worked in the U.S. government. I think he said he was a writer in the Bush administration, and his book is called American Leviathan. Right, all about attempting to downsize this bureaucratic state. And before we hit record, I was surprised to learn. I was bringing up this technocratic state that's budding now, and I mentioned 15-minute cities, and I think you said that during your time working, you came across some of those ideas. I recently had Australian Kate Mason on to talk about that, and I'm having the German Christian AI scientist dude, Jobs Landgrip. He's coming back on the podcast to further get into this stuff. He and his book, his academic book published on the subject, he said it's going to get its second edition, which is very almost unheard of, which is something. It says that there's something to his thesis, which kind of jives with what you said, that he thinks, when it comes to physics, like the reality is that a lot of these things that are projected by the Cobra Commander Klaus Schwabs of the world, or sometimes alternative media is guilty of projecting it even further for them, won't be possible. Just the news today out of, was it Canada? Canada. The new Democratic Party's bid to allow a universal basic income, UBI, for all Canadians and refugee claimants via legislation that would further put pressure on taxpayers has failed after most MPs voted against it. And so your thoughts on these 15-minute cities and this sort of technocratic push. We're seeing it in every country, digital IDs, these in Australia, this disinformation bill, thought crime, basically legislation. CJ Hopkins, past podcast guest today, he just was found guilty of thought crime in Germany. So he won his first case, and then they overturned it. And your sort of thoughts on this technocratic agenda and 15-minute cities and all that.
Well, look, I mean, I was a bureaucrat for 30 years and, I'm not a apostate. I do actually believe government is a necessary and positive contribution to the world. I mean, some of your more sort of libertarian American guests probably don't believe that, but we need to have institutions and people dedicated to those institutions to coordinate all the social problems that we have to live together. Like, how do we organise, how do we protect people from poverty, such as a universal basic income? How do we support people in aged care? How do we provide for people with mental health services? How do we run a hospital? How do we run schools? How do we defend ourselves? I mean, as far as I know, the only viable institution to do any of that is some form of government. So, I do believe in government, but government is a vastly more complex place or institution or culture than in a lot of the sort of philosophical political theories about it. I think in my book, 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat, I said there are no good books about bureaucracy, so I'm going to write one. And I think in a way the 15-minute cities is an example of that. It's been a sort of a bit of a cause, I guess, for particularly in the public health sort of world, the kind of world that was supercharged with power in 2020. A lot of people believe that it's better for our lives if, we walk, if we don't have a lot of pollution, or that sort of thing. So the 15-minute cities, or when I was working in the health department, and this idea was being proposed in Victoria, I don't know, it was 10 or so years ago. It is part of the government was preparing like a plan for metropolitan Melbourne, like a long-term planning vision for metropolitan Melbourne, like where the suburbs going to be and all that sort of thing. And the transport systems, all that sort of stuff. So there was one of the leading advisors on the committee that was developing that was a real exponent of, it was then 20-minute cities. And to some degree, without disclosing any confidential details, I mean, she was largely seen as a fanatical nuisance. But when government is orchestrating something as complicated as developing a 30-year plan for a city, you have to deal with the experts that you have, kind of thing, and you have to give them their moment in the sun, and you can sort of indulge some of the ideas without necessarily really backing them with real action. And so I think to some degree, some of the 15-minute cities, 20-minute cities, etc., are a way of packaging up a sense of doing something about all those issues of, people being leading healthier, more active lives, and also reducing environmental stresses, while also managing the sort of infrastructure dimensions of a city. And it's quite a convenient idea for governments at the moment, because most governments around the world, especially in the United States, I guess, at the moment, are not really, don't have lots of dough to, no one's building in the Western world effective mass transit systems, particularly, are they? So rather than actually engage in these long-term projects to do really significant things to actually support the actual lives of people in cities, some of these sort of ideas are packaged up and said, oh, look what wonderful things we're doing to support healthy lives in the city. We're going to turn ourselves into a 15-minute city or a 20-minute city. And look, as a result, we won't have to pay for a new railway line, or we won't have to build that new highway, or we won't have to, or whatever it is, sort out housing in a more convenient way. But we can be seen to be doing something really cute. But it's insanely impractical. Like I live in Melbourne, which is, I think, 5-6 million people, something like that. It probably would take me 10 or 15 minutes to drive to the closest shopping centre. I usually walk to the shopping centre, so that takes 20 or 30 minutes. So I'm sort of doing the right thing by the 15-minute city crowd, keeping myself healthy and active and fit, and, supporting local economies or something. But there's no way that, that's like a couple of kilometres. Melbourne is like 100 plus kilometres wide. It's enormous. So it's just a totally fanciful idea that people's movements can be sort of locked into this sort of trap. But nonetheless, sometimes in complex institutions like government, passionate people are able to capture, the right set of people in order to implement certain things about it. So I think in Britain, there've been a few local governments where, there's been quite relatively draconian movement rules or transport rules or parking fine rules, and anything which has the side benefit of, restricting people's behaviour while also, earning scarce tax revenue for government by fining people for walking for more than 15 minutes a day or driving for more than 15 minutes a day has appealed to some people and might get along. But the actual concept itself, I don't think will ever be fully realised. So you'll just get all these sort of, they'll be like, I don't know if they have this in Mexico or other states, but every now and then you sort of drive through a little town, a place in Australia, and it says, tidy town of 1974, or, some little initiative to promote a little local community from decades ago. And I think, in 20 years' time, we'll see all these silly faded signs in various places around the world saying, Mexico City is a 15-minute city.
We have, they call them here pueblos mágicos, magic towns, magic pueblos. And, a lot of Mexicans themselves, will go for weekends to these nice little, more traditional towns. And it's, it is very enjoyable. But, I've been mentioning how mainstream Mexican news, mainstream government Mexican accounts have been saying, we're going to divide Mexico City into multiple 15-minute cities. Other towns are announcing that in Mexico. And just one example, I hope you're right, but the vehicle emissions, in Mexico, that was never a thing. And until last year, at least where I am, you never had to do it, but the government really they finally got it right. Kind of like what you're alluding to. They got it right, and I had to take my car to my very first vehicle emissions in Mexico last year. And guess what? It's kind of what you're saying. I make this appointment. I get there like noon, and there's no electricity, so I couldn't do at the venue, the place, and I couldn't do my emissions test. I had to come back another day, But now they have the green police. I saw the other day right outside my home. They were green Mexican green vehicle emissions police. And they scan I guess they drive around scanning people's plates, and they see, did you do your emissions test or not? Oh, you didn't. They give you a ticket. So my point is, I hope you're right, but I still see them. Some ideas don't work because it's difficult to implement this technocracy. But it seems like sometimes they throw stuff and see what sticks, and sometimes things stick, and they do get to advance with some of this stuff. And I don't know if you caught Javier Milei's, for all the criticism, I don't know what to think of him, but at the UN, he did say the UN is this, world socialist government that's taking over control. The lockdowns were a crime. And so, but then people criticize him, he's shipping off gold to the UK, Argentina's gold. He wants to implement AI pre-crime policing. And so, but then he speaks well, and, I don't know. Any thoughts on that, or anything else that you're paying attention to? The U.S. I've sort of tuned out of anything that has to do with Trump or Kamala, and are we on like the 105th attempted assassination of Trump? I don't know. I'm not paying attention right now. Hillary Clinton came out today and said there might be some October surprise surrounding Kamala Harris, but I just feel like every day now, anything can happen. So what are some other things that you're paying attention to?
Well, look, America, I mean, I like to sometimes call Australia, where I live, as like the semi-autonomous province of the American Indo-Pacific Empire. And so it's sort of have this complicated, let's say, relationship with United States politics insofar as we feel sort of, and culture, because, like our newspapers get syndicated Washington Post from New York Times Journal things, Netflix, the whole American culture apparatus is constantly in our face, not to mention YouTube and, which I love you, YouTube, but, Substack, there is, it does. people in the outside world are constantly looking at Americans talking about the world as if the world is America, and I sometimes wish that people in America, and all the people who have an attachment to America around the world would maybe just stop talking about themselves for a year or so and just learn from the rest of the world for a change. But America does, whatever happens in the election, it's got a whole series of catastrophic problems, it seems to me. And it does actually relate to the previous discussion about hegemony and US power and all that sort of stuff. Because if America continues to want to be, number one, the most powerful country ever on earth, I think, as Joe Biden said, it just can't keep doing that, and it can't keep doing that at the cost of both its. There's something. I don't want to alienate any American viewers, but for people outside of America, there's just something deeply insulting about the way Americans just talk about the rest of the world as if it's just they're sort of in the situation room and America is manipulating the rest of the world. And it's not only insulting, it's just ultimately unsustainable. America really, it seems to me, is going to have to, at some point, address its domestic social problems. The historian Neil Ferguson wrote some article earlier in the year, which I wrote a Substack piece on, which was pretty critical of it, but there was an element of it that had truth, which was comparing, the late Soviet Union to America today in terms of problems with the health system, problems with repression of free speech, I guess, problems with its gerontocratic political elite. So I feel there is going to be, at some point, surely, a point at which the international balance of power shifts sufficiently for the domestic American elites to say, oh, maybe we should stop running an empire to have this dream of being number one in the world and actually pay attention to our internal problems. And I don't really see that happening in America. Every now and then, I heard Adam too say that one of the things he saw hope of with Kamala Harris was she was actually more focused on American domestic social policy and other type issues rather than foreign policy adventures. But I don't really see that happening, but it may happen. So that would be it. I certainly don't see that happening with Donald Trump, even though I'm sure some of your viewers love Donald Trump, but he seems really just to want to make America great again. And I feel, in a way, America might want to learn to be humble at last rather than great again. And just be, another country in the world, another country that actually realizes that the rest of the world looks at America's political system and says, what a mess. It looks at its health system and says, what a mess. It looks at its financial situation, what a mess. I, as a former bureaucrat, look at the nature of governing institutions like that, the way policing, health, education, law enforcement, the justice system's actually organised and coordinated in America. And I think, what a mess. And there's more than enough for America to do in terms of fixing its home base rather than keeping whatever it is, 800,000 military bases, threatening the rest of the world when the rest of the world is really not threatening America. So I sort of think about that a lot. But, I would hope at some point that will happen. But to some degree, my reading of history suggests that will only happen when there is, the illusion of keeping the military power that we talked about before with Israel, smashing defenseless civilians in Gaza and Lebanon stops, and America is to some degree experiences a genuine defeat and the real costs of a defeat. I suspect it will probably take something like that, and maybe the situation in Ukraine is going to be that. But I fear that's probably what needs to happen.
And
bit of a ramble there. I hope that's okay. Yeah, but
no, that's perfectly fine.
Just do it. Yeah,
for Geopolitics and Empire. And what you say, I mean, what happens in America just ripples around the world. All these just constant regime change attempts. I think in Bangladesh recently, they want to do Georgia again. They want to do Belarus. What's happening now in Mexico, I think in the north, was in Sinaloa. There's like a new mini civil war. A lot of people are dying. And there's reports that might have something to do with, what would you call it? Deep state, U.S. intelligence agency activity with Mexico and the cartels. And so just their hands are all over the planet. And there have been some funny memes today. One of them said, Biden administration to announce immediate assistance to aid the victims of Hurricane Helen out there in North Carolina. And it shows a map of the U.S. and North Carolina is labeled as Ukraine. And then another one was, where's the, I don't have the other one here, but yeah, they're pretty funny. And also, what you're saying, Keith Preston, who I've had on my TNT show many times, he points out that Trump Cabinet 2.0, who's in the running for top spots, and his comment says, Trump is apparently considering Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio for Secretary of State and Defense, bringing back Mike Pompeo. Those guys are neocon parodies.
Disastrous.
How is this anti-war or an improvement over Bidenism? And again, whether it's Kamala or Trump. Oh, I was going to mention Trump is talking about war with Iran. I do not. I actually don't believe what this was in my weekend write up as well. Senator Mike Lee tweeted a video reportedly that Tehran had on their website, this really poor cartoonish AI animation, supposedly Iran saying they want to assassinate Trump, and then Trump saying they're trying to assassinate me, and that really sets the ground, the ground level framing propaganda for going to war with Iran. It's kind of that kind of meshes well with what Israel is doing in Lebanon, and so it's crazy. They're now entering Lebanon. They just bombed Yemen yesterday, and so any other thoughts? You seem in general to be optimistic. So we are transitioning to a new system I like to call it the 100-year storm. People can call it whatever they like, fourth turning, and so forth. And so, any other thoughts on the way forward?
Well, I do think in 20 years' time, people will look back and say American supremacism, which is a term I use for American exceptionalism, was a toxic ideology. And maybe in America, there will be things like what happens in Germany after 1945 and a reckoning, a coming to terms with the history of American supremacism. But yeah, I do. I mean, I guess my grounds for optimism is ultimately politics is a small part of life. It's that old, I think both Chinese and Russian saying is the world is a big place and the emperor is far, far away. And it's like I don't read the newspapers anymore, apart from just sort of scanning the headlines and saying, "Oh, what's the story they're trying to spin today?" And I think we can, I guess, find in our more local lives, or our more local is perhaps the wrong term in today's virtual world. Here I am in Melbourne, there you are in Mexico. But in our more, I guess, close-knit cultural connections, we can find, meaningful ways to live a good life as well as possible. And I think that is to some degree the antidote to all the bad technocracy and the bad political elites as well. I mean, if there are any bureaucrats out there, any deep staters like me out there listening to the show, or people aspiring to be deep staters, then, you can try to, as I did, really try to lead a ethical life within the institutions that, you're placed within. So I think that's the grounds for optimism. But I do worry that we might have big conflict. But I think at the end of it, I sometimes imagine there'll be like a Treaty of Delhi in 2029, and Narendra Modi will bring the world together, and it will be like the Treaty of Westphalia in whenever it was, 1649. And the Spanish Empire, the Habsburg Empire will no longer try to be the world power, that there will be a sense of sovereign equality between cultures and nations again, and we'll all have a little bit more space just to live on this earth together. That's my optimistic vision. There are obviously every now and then I have darker visions as well, but that's my optimistic vision.
Something we can look forward to. I talked to Cameron Leckie and other past guests who said, 2027. Again, just this morning, if I could pull up this article, it's funny. It goes on the heels of what he and I were talking about. Just here it is. About the U.S. new fleet-wide guidance from the Navy's top officer focuses on preparing the service for a potential war with China by 2027 as the maritime component of a joint warfighting ecosystem. So, what you said, hopefully that happens without a war, but after a war, we always have to pick up the pieces. Anyways, so there will be some sort of treaty or agreement. And what you mentioned about the news as well, I basically just look at my local news to see what's happening locally, and of course I paid attention to international news. But as I get older, I get more impatient and grumpy, and just sort of like don't really care. Kind of what you said, don't really care so much what's happening outside of my immediate vicinity. And this is what I often tell people: just live life, enjoy life. Don't freak out too much. And as I get older, like I said, I focus more on the local, what's happening around me. But of course, part of my passion is paying attention to what's happening around the world globally. So, great.
And reading good history and literature, which is what I like to do on the Burning Archive as well.
And I think that is also very important, particularly for listeners who maybe just consume the daily, the news junkie. I'm reading a lot of books, and I think that gives you the really wide-ranging, big picture of what is going on. And I think that is kind of the number one thing you should be doing. And number two is catching up with the news cycle. But again, everything in good measure. So thanks for coming on again, Jeff. Your links are all in the description, your X account, Substack, website, Amazon, where people can get your books. Any other final thought or project you want to mention?
Well, I'm not sure when this will be coming up, but one project I wouldn't mind mentioning is it's reading good books is one thing. And on my YouTube channel and on my Substack, I've just been doing this insane project of reading every single winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature since 1901 or to 2023, or 120 of them. So it's actually been a fascinating window into, I guess, the cultural history of the modern world, like, Cold War and World War I, World War II. You have a few German nationalists from the 1920s and 1930s, and then we have, Winston Churchill wins the Nobel Prize for Literature at one point, and there's sex scandals and all sorts of things. So I think if you want a bit of a break from the day-to-day bad news of the world, I think check that little project out, because there's a lot of inspiring writing in all of that as well, including a great Polish poet, Wisława Szymborska, who wrote a poem called The End and the Beginning, where she said something pretty much exactly what you just said, Revoyer. After every war, someone has to clean up.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, fascinating. And I like to do that also from time to time. I do it in different ways. I think people need to disconnect and look at art, literature, film. I'll when I get sick of geopolitics and empire, I go knock out some video games or put on some films. Lately I found this huge music channel, and I'm going back to when I was a kid, and this guy's he's able to interview some of these really famous rock musicians that I used to see at concerts a long time ago. And it's a nice, I think something really nice happens when you disconnect from your work, whatever, in our case, international relations, and you look at something completely unrelated, and then you come back with sort of a new hunger, and you're refreshed. And so, Jeff, is always, great to chat. Your links are in the description, and stay safe out there in Australia. If things pop off for China, you're, I think, one of the first targets. Yeah,
absolutely. Bit of a worry. Lovely to talk to you, Revoyer.
All right, until next time.